Let me just start out. My name is Hans Geyer, and I didn't give my kind of educational credentials. I graduated with an undergrad in food engineering from Purdue University, and just last year, in my 50s, I finally got a master's degree in food safety from Michigan State. And I've enjoyed being a learner now so much that I'm pursuing my degree in certified financial planning, which is my next endeavor. So I'm here to talk a little about how chocolate is made and more the part that happens outside of the US. So as you go through this, you can think about what kind of careers are in there, and I'll kind of point out some things when we get to the end. But really what I want to do is have fun and just kind of make you aware of what happens within part of our food chain, our food supply chain, especially some things that happen outside of the US. So take it away. Next slide then. All right. So this is my background. I worked 15 years for M&M Mars, and I helped set up a number of green site facilities throughout the world. And I worked in Poland, I worked in Brazil, I worked in cocoa and nut processing, chocolate process development, and I really traveled quite a bit for M&M Mars throughout the world. I've been with Hershey 18 years now. I was a process improvement engineer. Then I worked in kind of chocolate and technology and how we make it. And for about the last 12 years, I've been responsible for cocoa, dairy, sugar, fats and oils, and sourcing it and things like that. So that's a little bit about my background. Let's jump right into cocoa. So most people have never seen a cocoa tree. So here's my first question to you. I'm going to ask a lot of questions. Go ahead and slap them into the chat, your answers. What are the top cocoa producing countries? And a little hint, I blacked out that area. It's got to be 15 degrees north and south of the equator. And why is that? A cocoa tree, to grow well, likes an average temperature on a year-round basis of 80 degrees. So that's pretty warm. I mean, that's night, day, winter, summer. It likes 80 degrees. So it looks like we've got quite a few people really hammering it. People are naming a lot of origins, a lot of small origins. Cocoa, if we bounce to the next slide, I should have the true answers posted on that next slide. So this is kind of the world's cocoa production there. Right now, 63% comes from those two little countries of Ivory Coast, some people call it Cote d'Ivoire, and Ghana. And really the big one there is Ivory Coast. It produces the majority, around 43% of the world's crop. Ghana produces about 20%, so they're really the workhorses. Right next door, you have Nigeria and Cameroon, which also produce a lot. After that, you jump over to South America, and Brazil produces cocoa. But a lot of people don't realize this. Brazil does not export cocoa. They actually import cocoa because their domestic crop isn't big enough for their internal consumption. So all these countries, you can see they're right around the equator. Now, there's a lot of small countries that do a little bit here. So like a Costa Rica, a Madagascar does make some. Somebody put that in the chat. Tanzania, Dominican Republic, Colombia, all those are minor growers, but really the workhorses of the industry are the Ivory Coast, West African area, and then some of the Peru, Ecuadors are coming on. So that's a little bit around how cocoa is, or where we source it within the Hershey Company. Here's a bonus question for you. Hershey is a very large chocolate company. What percent of the world's cocoa crop do you think Hershey ends up in a Hershey product? And when you think about cocoa, it goes a lot of different places. It's not just chocolate. Think about chocolate ice cream. Think about brownies. Think about just everything, donuts, anything that's chocolatey, most likely has cocoa in it. So there's a lot of companies that are chocolate companies or use cocoa that you don't think of being cocoa companies. So Krispy Kreme makes chocolate donuts. They're like a chocolate company. So let's see. We got some really good guesses there. On a global basis, Hershey uses 5% of the world's cocoa. So 1 out of every 20 cocoa beans ends up in a Hershey product in some format. So that's kind of an area of how kind of the scale that Hershey has. And most of our business is in the US, so really about 4.8% of that 5% is in the US. So we're really big there. So cocoa, one thing that's unique about cocoa, the flower is actually right up against the tree itself. And the reason why the flower is on the tree is because that's where the cocoa pod forms. And cocoa pods are heavy. These are big pieces. They got like 60 to 100 beans in there. And they can weigh pounds. So if you had a cocoa pod at the end of your branch, it would actually break the branch. So they grow right up on the tree. It takes about 180 days for a cocoa pod to develop, and a tree will give you about 60 pods per tree, and that's a good tree. I won't ask you this question because it's too technical, but this Diptera xerica something or other, I can't pronounce it. That's actually the insect that pollinates cocoa, because you need pollination in order to form the pod. So that's a little bit about the tree itself. Another thing that's unique about cocoa is it actually gives fruit throughout the entire year. So in West Africa, there's a main harvest, which is really October, November, December timing. But then there's another harvest that's more like June, July, August. But in between those two harvests, it continues to put off pods, just not very many. So it's not like an apple tree where you get like one harvest a year. It can produce throughout the entire year, which is interesting because you can always kind of have pods coming off. All right, next slide. So here's some of the typical types of cocoa that are out there, and really the three that are the Criollo, the Trinitario, and the Nacional. Those are small. Those are like 5% of the world's cocoa crop. The big one is the Forastero, which is up in the upper right corner. The reason why that's the most popular one is, quite frankly, it yields the best. So the farmer makes the most money. And it also has the flavor that people would recognize as chocolate. So almost all the cocoa that you would have in a product would be Forastero. And that's what's growing in Africa and Brazil and Ecuador and everything else. So here's a bonus question for you. What classic soda bottle is based off the shape of a cocoa pod? Oh man, Damien, we're gonna have to X you off here. Some other people got it too. Very good. So rumor has it, if you have STEM skills, you might do research to figure this one out. But Coke, when they were rich, most people know that Coke was originally had cocaine in it. And they transitioned it from like a cocaine-based material to a soft drink without the cocaine. The original shape of the bottle, they went and they looked at coca areas, and they actually picked a cocoa pod to help shape their bottle. It sounds like coca, but it's not. So that's just an interesting tidbit for you. The actual shape of the Coca-Cola bottle comes from a cocoa pod. So here's another question for you. This is what we call a cut test. This is how we evaluate the quality of cocoa beans. So we chop them in half and we look at the color. So here's a question for you. What color is a cocoa bean when it's first harvested, when it's fresh? And you cut it open. All right, we're getting some answers in there. Nobody's got the right answer yet. You got to think a little bit outside of the box on this one, maybe. All right, and let's see the next slide, and everybody will get it. Oh, Damien got the right one there. Purple. They are bright purple, almost like the bright purple of a purple cabbage plant. And that's because it's loaded with anthocyanins, and a lot of really healthy polyphenols are in the product. I actually have a number of patents going back to my days with Mars when we were patenting the health benefits of kind of raw cocoa and all these polyphenols that were in there. So it's purple. But if you eat that purple product, oh my gosh, it is so bad tasting. You would not recognize it as cocoa that you eat. So now we're going to go into what happens to change it from this purple material to actually something you recognize as more of a chocolate flavor. So, okay, next slide, please. So what we do, the first step in origin is actually to break open the pod. And those are pods. You can see in the upper left, the beans are actually covered with pulp. That pulp really tastes good. It's kind of like a real sweet, fruity flavor. That's all I can describe it as, because there's no other fruit that I've eaten that would really compare to the sweet, fruity flavor. Those are actually good to kind of suck on and chew on and eat, but you don't want to eat the actual bean itself. So these are all broken open, generally out in the field or in the plantation area, and then they're put into some kind of container. So you get a bunch of these beans and they're covered with all this sweet, pulpy mass. So the pulp creates them. And if you flip to the next picture, the next thing we do is fermentation, and it's actually a controlled rotting is how I would explain it. You grab all these beans, and I'll show you how it's done. But the key is, like, you got all this sweet, gooey pulp on the outside, and you need to get rid of that. And if you don't get rid of it, it's hard to process your cocoa. It's hard to take the shell off. So as the product ferments in this heap, which I'll show you in a moment, the actual bean dies and polyphenol oxidase reacts, and that starts reducing a lot of the bitterness. So it's actually the beans dying, and you reduce the astringency by the polyphenol oxidase. At the same time, there's other reactions that go on that create these aromatic flavors. There's fruity flavors, winey flavors. And at the same time, some of the chocolate precursors form in the form of proteins. And if they do this step wrong, then we get bad flavors. Think of things like hammy, fishy, ammonia, earthy, moldy. So if it's not quite done right, or if it goes out of control, you can get these bad flavors. And then the final thing is it actually increases the content, the fat content, because you ferment carbohydrates. All right, next slide. So this is actually in Africa. And they have banana leaves. So they make kind of like an umbrella on the ground of banana leaves, and then they'll pour the mass of cocoa on there. So we're going kind of top left to top right. They've poured the mass of cocoa in there. And what happens is, they think about a fermentation, you got a microbe somewhere. What they've done is studies have actually shown it's the hands of the workers that actually inoculate the cocoa beans. To start that fermentation reaction. They then cover the heap with banana leaves, and that's what you see down there in the left corner, and they kind of pile it together in banana leaves, so it's kind of like this pile of banana leaves with the cocoa in the middle, and that kind of helps hold in the heat, and they ferment it that way for 3 days. And then they open that heap up. Oh, go back. Stay there. We got some other techniques we'll talk about. They open it up and then they turn it over, and that's kind of like stirring the pot. Fermentation will get a lot hotter in the center, so they want to move the beans around so some of them aren't, to get the same level, so that it's kind of like a homogeneous type of fermentation. All right, and this is actually what our gold standard is for how we like to see cocoa processed, with banana leaves and a pile rotting in the jungle. And countries like the Ivory Coast, Ghana, Nigeria, this is how they do it. All right, next one. Some other origins where there's bigger places, they actually bring the wet beans in, and they stick the wet beans into these boxes. And some of them are set up so that, let's say there's 4 boxes. Every day, the cocoa will move from one box, starting at the top, down to the next, down to the next, down to the next. And during that time, when they move from one box to the next, the whole thing gets kind of mixed around so that it helps the fermentation process be even. And you can see here the fermentation process, you're seeing the carbon dioxide coming off as the sugar ferments away. There's a lot of inoculation that goes on here, because you can see people standing on the cocoa beans and helping kick them from one box to the next. This is common in origins. This is what happens, but this would happen more in like Brazil, Papua New Guinea. The Dominican Republic has a lot of fermentaries like this, where they make specialty products, and Mexico has some places where they do this. So this is what we call box fermentation. And it tends to make a very sour product because it's over fermented. So you get a lot more of the acetic acid forming. So it's more of a sour cocoa. All right, next slide. And then there's other things where small places, some origins don't really ferment. They'll just throw it into bags, and they'll just kind of rot in the bags or ferment in the bags. Other places will have small vats. And in Mexico, they make a product called lavado, which means washing, and they actually just wash the pulp off and they just throw it out to dry. Those beans are really bitter and astringent, and you really won't want to make a chocolate out of them. You can use them as a component, but they're just really bitter and astringent. Okay, on to our next slide. So that's a little about fermentation. It's really important. So here's the actual colors of the beans, and this is how we evaluate fermentation. So slaty is just not fermented at all. It's actually a defective bean, and those taste incredibly bitter. The next phase is purple. Reminds you of how that fresh bean looks. They really haven't been fermented. That's how a lavado bean would look. These beans were actually in Ecuador from a trip that I took down there 2 years ago. What we like to see is purple, brown, and brown more so, because brown is well fermented, and those are going to give you really good chocolate flavor. So that's a little bit about how we evaluate fermentation. There's all kinds of fancy methods, but at the end of the day, this is what the industry uses. Next slide. So once they're dried, once they're fermented, they need to be dried. And the way we do this is by just stretching them out in the sun and allowing the sun to dry them. Cocoa needs to get down to 8% moisture to prevent things like mold from growing, to deactivate some of the enzymes, which would create some negative reactions in the beans. So we like to see it less than 8%. And once it's below that, it can stop drying. So next slide. That's sun drying. That's what we really like, because it allows some of those acids to volatilize. So you get a really pleasant tasting cocoa. Other places where it's too rainy and not enough sun, we'll actually dry it using mechanical dryers, very similar to grain dryers that American farmers would use for corn or soybean. In this situation, the interesting thing is that it locks in a lot of the sour flavor when you use these techniques. All right, next slide. So this is something we don't like to see happen. Some places will actually burn wood, and that wood and smoke go into the dryer, and then the beans get a smoky flavor, which is a defect. I don't want to talk poorly about other or some manufacturers' products, but some origins like Papua New Guinea and Brazil use a lot of that type of beans. So Papua New Guinea, because it's on the Ghirardelli, because they're on the West Coast, they'll bring in Papua New Guinea beans and use those in their formulation. And when I taste their baking chips and their dark chocolate squares, you get some of that smokiness and some of the sourness from the Papua New Guinea beans. But that's what their consumers like, so they're making a product that's good. All right, next slide. So I'm kind of at the end of my time on this. Kim, how am I doing on time overall?
Yeah, you're doing fine. Let's probably just go over a few minutes on questions, but you're doing good.
Before I talk about careers in the food industry, of which Lou's covered some of it already, are there any questions that people have that they'd like to ask about chocolate or cocoa or things of that nature? I'm really good at making stuff up, by the way.
Oh, sweet.
If you can stump me.
Actually, one that came up that actually is really interesting is do you know, when you talk about the fermentation of the cocoa, what bacteria is it? Do we know what microbes it is?
Absolutely not. Okay. So it is so I will give you an interesting story on that. There was a company. So you think about like wine, and oops, this is high school students, but I guess it's food science. So in wine or cheese making, you might use very specific cultures to start. Or wine, you use a very specific bacteria. Beer, you might use so anything you're fermenting, you might use a very specific bacteria. They tried to do that in cocoa. It made a very specific flavor that did not work well for us. So what the bacteria they actually found that are doing the fermentation, whatever was on the person cutting it open's hands. That's what goes into the fermentation. So awesome. There's no magic there.
No, I mean, that was
whatever's on the banana leaf, whatever's on the stick they're hitting it with, whatever's in the bin. They've tried to control it, but haven't been able to have that same success like you have with cheese, wine, beer, other fermented products. Can we grow cocoa at home? So in Hershey, Pennsylvania, put a plug in for Hershey. We have Hershey Chocolate World, and occasionally, well, you will see flowers. Number one, they have cocoa trees in Chocolate World. You will see flowers on the trees. I've never seen a full grown pod, but you will get the real teeny tiny pods that are maybe an inch long. I've never seen one fully mature, probably not enough humidity or something of that nature, or maybe not the right bugs, or I guess they would be bugs because you wouldn't get a pod otherwise. But yeah, really hard to grow cocoa at home. You can actually grow a plant at home, but you'll never get a pod on it. Actually, Penn State, and I'll put a, being from Pennsylvania, Penn State is probably the leading kind of chocolate school in the U.S. And they're, they do genetic works and things like that on how to reproduce cocoa plants and things of that nature.
All right, they're doing some other very interesting crop stuff over there.
Yeah. Any other questions on cocoa?
The last one, I think, actually, or I have to double check here too. Hold on. How much polyphenol is retained kind of like at the end of the cocoa processing? Like when you get a dried bean? So
let's not go dried bean. Let's go all the way to
chocolate.
Yeah, let's go to dark chocolate.
Okay.
So of the liquor, which is the product that contains the cocoa that goes in there, on average, it's probably like 30 to 35% would be retained. So there's a huge chunk that's lost during fermentation. So the more you ferment, the lower it goes. And then when you roast it, roasting is an oxidation reaction. So roasting will take it down. And then your next step is if you combine it with certain things that have free radicals, then they'll start quenching that and it'll take it down even further. So as you make a milk chocolate compared to a dark chocolate, the milk interacts with it and binds it. So they kind of all go down. It all depends on how you measure it also. But generally, the way I look at it is anything that makes it taste good reduces it. So that's kind of, unfortunately, that's one of the things. If you want to get healthy stuff, you got to learn to eat it raw.
Awesome. And then you want to finish up your slides, then we'll get Lou back on and ask some more questions.
Yeah, so Lou pointed out a lot of these things here, a lot of the different careers. And I think for me, the most important thing when I think about what STEM careers, and a STEM, I'll even just say a STEM education, it really teaches you to think in a very kind of logical, scientific manner. And I think that's what carries over into your career and how you think about things and how you evaluate opportunities and where you go, because you're using kind of some of those same fundamentals that you learned during school of researching, investigating, being inquisitive. So Kim, if you could flip the slide here. So Purdue Engineers, there's a number of Purdue engineers that work at Hershey. And I'm an agricultural engineer, and I am the only Purdue engineer doing what I consider, well, I shouldn't tell you that. The next person does a technical thing, but I'm probably closest to engineering of any of the Purdue engineers. And I'm working with engineering principles and science principles. I have a colleague that I went to school with. He's actually in our data analytics area, and he does data analytics. He started more on the sensory side where there's a ton of data analytics, and he's migrated to the human resources side doing data analytics. So, he was a food engineer. He learned how to make food at Purdue with me, and now he's in analytics. Chemical engineer, our chief procurement officer, so the person who's responsible for all the people that buy all the stuff. And buying is a big thing as a company because you always got to buy all your raw materials, even your marketing, advertisements, things of that nature. Really big job. That person's a chemical engineer at Hershey. And then another person that buys all of our media, he's a chemical engineer from Purdue. And that's a totally different skill in working with media buying, understand impressions and how to get that message out there and how to work through the decisions in that area. Once again, your STEM education pays off. And then the one that I just find absolutely crazy is our chief growth officer for a consumer product company like Hershey. This is one of the most powerful positions in the company. Like I think on the org chart, they're like number 3 type of thing. She's a mechanical engineer from Purdue. and I think she was also a professional engineer. So it's just crazy for me to think like these are all the engineers at Hershey. I'm the only one doing anything technical. So when you think about careers, don't limit yourself to like, oh, I need to be in a science or lab or designing something. There's all these other areas where you can apply sound science and those skills you learn via STEM education. So that's my little poll: is that technical degrees open doors.
How, like when you talk about these processes, how applicable are they to other industries?
How do these cocoa and chocolate and confectionery skills translate to the rest of the food industry? I really focus in on a lot of the quality aspects of food. Like all food companies have to have their quality programs the government mandates, and we have to meet them. And most companies, like big branded companies, we go way beyond that. So regardless of what's going on in food, you have to have a validated kill step, which means if there's any pathogens, you got to figure out how to knock them out. Things like what's food safe, like think about like contaminants that can be in the products, toxicology, nutrients is a huge area. So all this stuff is things that I kind of have to worry about. Like when I'm thinking about like cocoa, it's like, okay, does that cocoa contain lead? Because lead is really bad for humans. So how do we take it down? And those kind of things are generally what you looked at throughout the entire kind of food chain for quality, and those apply across whatever food you're making. It just looks a little bit different if you're making dairy versus raw vegetables versus chocolate.
My dad is a dairy guy.
Yeah, so dairy, it's very regulated, and there's very specific pasteurization projects, and that's, pasteurization, Pasteur, kind of that's where it all started. But those kind of food safety skills really translate across all of it. And then the other, aside from that, like the part that I really enjoy about my job is not the part that's translatable. It's the part where you sit down and say, hey, I'm an expert. I'm going to taste this and figure out like whether it's good or not. So sometimes it's like some of those niche things you get to do that are a lot more fun than the translatable stuff. The translatable stuff tends to be more like bog standard, and the things that are really fun are kind of these niche areas you get to play in.
Awesome. So can you actually both speak a little bit more about kind of like where you're seeing some of these like new jobs like data science and like automation really like coming into full force?
Everybody here's gone into a grocery store and seen like, oh man, one of my favorite products isn't there, right? It's happening everywhere. And one of the big reasons for that is that we don't have people showing up for work to actually make part of the product that's that's critical in making something. We have run out of so many things over the past 2 years because the supply chain is just broken. And one of the pieces it's heavily human dependent. And what I see happening is that one of the reasons inflation is going up because wages are really increasing. And how does this refer back to technology? Technology is the answer that the US uses to bring down our costs. So we put a technology solution on it. So you think about like, well, what can we automate? At one time people were hand wrapping kisses. When Milton made that first kiss, it got hand wrapped. We are now wrapping kisses at 800 to 1,000 a minute on a machine. And it's crazy. And that's the kind of thing that's constantly happening as labor costs go up, which there's natural tendencies to drive labor up because we all want a higher standard of living. The way you push back is better technologies to automate things. It's office work, it's production work, it's the whole 9 yards. Like when you go into a factory at Hershey, there might be 3 people running a line that makes 100,000 pounds in 8 hours. And that's the kind of automation that's just going to continue. So it's not only, it's the people developing the equipment, it's people maintaining the equipment, it's the people putting in the equipment, and that trend's just going to continue.
Awesome. No, that's a great answer. And I've had other people do manufacturing kind of talk. It's a lot of that stuff, right? Is just like, how are we making things faster? I also want to thank our sponsors, which are the Better Them Foundation, Virginia Department of Higher Education, Illumina BAE Systems, Broadmoor Charitable Foundation, Akamai Technologies, Aerojet, Rocketdyne, Equitrans, Midstream, Jacobs Engineering, Lockheed Martin, and TC Energy Foundation.